Hi, everyone. It's Jamie, and I'm here today to present my paper on Beyond One Language, the intersection of translanguaging and deep reading. It explores a particular tension that I really couldn't let go of this semester and truly the greater part of this year, and that is what happens when we bring translanguaging into the conversation with what we know about deep reading. I have had the privilege and joy of attending a lot of symposiums and conferences this year. First, the Literacy Launch Initiative, which was a 4-day collaborative experience here in Massachusetts, and then the Massachusetts Association of Science Teachers, where I was not only able to attend but facilitate a session on data talks in the K through 2 classroom. And then most recently, I attended the Massachusetts Reading Association's annual conference and also got to present on data talks there as well. And I will say, in every space that I visited, as a multilingual learner myself, somebody asked about multilingual learners and how best to support them in their deep reading, close reading, or vocabulary acquisition. And in every single room that I sat in, there was someone who said, I don't know much about translanguaging, but I'm reading more about translanguaging, and I feel like translanguaging is going to be something that'll definitely support. And I was like, do we define translanguaging? Do we know what translanguaging is? Are we talking about the same thing? And is translanguaging creeping towards what's going to become the new buzzword in education, which is sort of like the Band-Aid to put over so many things? And I am not about that life. So I was like, can we learn a little bit more about translanguaging and how it interacts with deep reading? Because I think I thought there was space for both. And then through my research, I've sort of found that to be true, but also needed a little bit of supporting language to make sure that that makes sense for all learners. So the problem really comes from a very personal place as a multilingual learner myself, in classrooms where multilingual learners are doing something incredibly complex, right? They're making meaning from text while navigating multiple languages, multiple identities, and multiple ways of knowing. And at the same time, literacy research is raising concerns about whether students are still developing the capacity for deep reading, for things like sustained attention, inferencing, and integration, all of which take a lot on our cognition, multilingual learners or not. And what struck me is that these two conversations feel like they're happening separately, which is very education of us. Like two different rooms are having a conversation that are adjacent but never talking to each other. So research in cognition reading, particularly Wolf and Willingham, like we read this semester, have raised concerns about whether students are developing the sustained attention and inferential thinking required for that deep reading process. So cognitive research kind of gives us a detailed picture of what happens inside the reader's mind. Brain science is something that I've always been interested in. So this semester has been a lot of fun sort of learning more about the way the brain works, but the way that we give demand to attention or working memory or inference. Translanguaging research, on the other hand, has focused on how meaning is constructed socially across languages and different modalities, and both care about comprehension, but they rarely speak to each other. And that gap has kind of become the center of my paper. It makes me a little anxious too, to like think about the fact that we have this tool that we want to use to support our multilingual learning students, but we're not necessarily navigating what multilingual learning students will have to do in our mainstream classrooms. So this is an important question to be answered. Does translanguaging enhance or constrain multilingual learners' engagement in the cognitive processes required for deep reading? Right? We have a finite amount of brain power to put towards something. And so if all of it's going into one thing, are we able to multitask and do more than one process at a time and do it successfully or do it well? First, let's start with just defining translanguaging. I find whenever I'm in a room and somebody's positing translanguaging as the answer, I'm sort of like, can we define it so we all know what we're saying it is? Garcia and Way describe translanguaging as drawing from a unified linguistic repertoire rather than switching between separate languages. When Garcia talks about translanguaging, she's pushing back on a really deeply rooted idea in education that languages exist as separate bounded systems. And instead, she's arguing that multilingual learners don't actually operate that way, that we're not switching between languages like flipping a switch. We're drawing from a full unified repertoire of linguistic resources. So translanguaging isn't just about using two languages, it's about removing the restrictions around the language uses altogether. And that shift matters so much because it reframes language as a tool for thinking and meaning making rather than something that has to be controlled or kept separate. And that's where my question kind of started to take shape, because if we rethink how language works in this way, it raises new questions about what happens during reading, especially those kinds of deep, sustained reading that we care so deeply about in school and that connect with things like close reading or vocabulary acquisition. This is the central tension that drove my paper. On one hand, translanguaging clearly expands access to meaning. It allows multilingual learners to draw on their full linguistic repertoires, which supports comprehension and participation. But on the other hand, deep reading depends on something very specific. It requires sustained attention. It requires the integration of ideas and the precision in language processing. So this tension becomes so paramount. Like, what supports meaning in one moment may also then increase the cognitive demand in another. And that's where my argument sits. Translanguaging is not inherently supportive or inherently constraining, but that its impact depends on how it shapes attention, cognitive load, and that engagement with the language of the text. So this becomes the central finding that emerged across the literature. Translanguaging is not inherently supportive, and it's not inherently constraining. Its impact depends on how it shapes cognitive processes during reading, particularly attention to cognitive load and engagement with the language of the text. When it's used to stabilize meaning and reduce confusion, it can actually support that deeper comprehension and lead to deep reading. But when it's unstructured or used as a buzzword, it may split attention across systems or increase processing demands in ways that actually interfere with the ability to sustain reading for a longer period of time. So the takeaway isn't whether to use translanguaging, it's how intentionally it's designed in relation to the demands of deep reading. Across the literature, studies suggest that translanguaging can actually deepen understanding, especially through metalinguistic awareness and vocabulary development, as seen in work by Sapera and Proctor and Avalos and colleagues. At the same time, cognitive research reminds us that attention and working memory are limited resources. These implications pushed me to think differently about translanguaging in practice. First, it becomes a matter of design, not just inclusion. It's not enough to allow students to use multiple languages. We have to think about how that use is structured in our classrooms. Second, attention has to be protected. Deep reading depends on sustained focus, so language practices need to support, not fragment, that attention. And third, there is a balance between flexibility and precision. Students should be able to draw on their full linguistic repertoire, but they also need to engage with the language of the text in meaningful ways. So ultimately, translanguaging and deep reading don't automatically align. They have to be intentionally aligned through instruction. And this is where I think the literature pushes us beyond simple instructional strategies. Scholars like Escamilla and Hopewell remind us that monolingual assumptions actually shape instruction, while other research suggests we need more alignment between discourse practices and cognitive processes. The question that I'm still sitting with is this. Where is the line between supporting meaning and overloading cognition? Sort of more specifically, how do we know when translanguaging is actually helping students engage more deeply with a text and when it might actually be pulling attention away from the processes we're trying to build? That's the piece that I don't think the field has fully answered yet, and I would love to hear your thinking. Just so I can finish with an anecdote from my own classroom, I think about my multilingual learners in the fall when we are reading about how do you know it's fall and all of the different scientific terms around the tannins in leaves and how they change colors. And I think translanguaging has a beautiful piece here in our science terminology in order to connect like sounding words and able to connect vocabulary pieces for my multilingual learners. But if I were to change the texts completely so that they had access to their ability to read thoroughly the text, I would also be changing the experience of the learning in the science classroom. And so it's why I'm going to encourage those students to be reading those texts, but I need to also make sure that I do my due diligence with translanguaging so that I'm intentionally designing some experiences for them to develop a stronger understanding of the technical vocabulary within the STEM lab. Thank you so much for listening. A part of multilingual learning research that I think is so powerful is that we have to keep these conversations going, because I don't think that there is one way or one best way to support multilingual learning rock stars. And so when we keep the conversations ongoing, I think that opens more windows and doors for our learners. Thanks so much.